name is Will, and this is the 21st video in a series about the Martian Manhunter. This is going to be about the 1998 Martian Manhunter solo comic written by John Ostrander. This series had 40 issues, including annuals, and instead of talking about it all in one video, I'm going to break it down by topics. This first topic will be about the changes to Ja'an's origin. One of the really weird things about the Martian Manhunter comic was that issue number 1 was the 4th issue of the comic. A 0 issue, a 1/1,000,000th issue, and an annual all came out before issue number 1. It was kind of an interesting way to do it, because the 0th issue kind of laid out the character's past, while the 1/1,000,000th issue laid out his future. But right now we're going to talk about the past. Now, some writers, when they come to a long-running character, will just try and wipe the slate clean and redefine the character. J.M. DeMatteis is a great example of this. He wanted a Bradbury-style Martian and not a Burroughs-style Martian. So he presented a new origin, which basically said everything about the character was a lie, because Ja'an had a traumatic event that caused a psychic split, which caused his previous personality to form over his real personality. But DeMatteis made allowances, saying that the superhero Martian Manhunter was a role this alien was playing. DeMatteis' changes included a dead wife and daughter, a previously unknown true form of Martians, and that the Martians had died from a plague. This directly contradicted a lot of Dennis O'Neil stories, like where Ja'an wasn't even the last Martian, and the Martians invaded Earth. DeMatteis had also explained the fire weakness as a result of Ja'an's psychic trauma watching his wife's body burn after she died from the plague. Now, Morrison had kind of ignored this when bringing back the Pale Martians, and he brought back the idea that all Martians were vulnerable to fire. He also brought back the idea that there were two types of Martians, green and pale Martians, and that they had warred against each other. Now, John Ostrander comes to this character and these contradictions, and he tries to heal the divide by being in line with the existing depiction of the character while also adding some new concepts. But he does discard a couple elements. The idea that Ja'an had a psychic split that caused him to develop a new personality is discarded. And to be honest, this part of the character was not referenced much. For example, Mark Waid seemed to ignore it in JLA Year 1. What was referenced was the idea that Ja'an had a true form. This form showed up many times and was even referenced by the Bronze Age embracing Morrison. Now, the reason for a true form and a fake form originally was that the true form belonged to Ja'an's original personality, while the fake form belonged to the constructed identity that existed to protect him. Morrison would imply that Ja'an didn't show his true form in order to prevent scaring humans, which was in line with why Ja'an kept using his standard form even when he learned of his true form. But with the split identity that wasn't mentioned much being discarded, and the true form which had been referenced consistently over the years being kept, Ostrander needed a reason for a true form versus a fake form. He could have used the idea that a normal form for Ja'an existed to make humans more comfortable, but he went in another direction. What he presented was that Martians had a public form and a private form for family, and this fit decently with what had been shown. Cases where his standard fake form was recognized as Martian made sense, and the idea that his true form was private, which was an idea that had crept in, also made sense. He also used Martian culture to explain another difference between Ja'an's two supposed personalities. So Joseph Semexon had originally presented Ja'an as a scientist. Dennis O'Neil had added on him being a military leader. DeMatteis didn't really give a specific profession for Ja'an, but described all the Martians as artists and philosophers. But on Earth, Ja'an had been a detective and superhero. So DeMatteis had presented one personality as a philosopher and one as a detective superhero. Ostrander alters this to present the idea that every Martian had two roles. Ja'an's are philosopher and manhunter. Now, the word manhunter had been used as an alliterative slang for detective, but the name Martian Manhunter had outlived this slang, and to be honest, it didn't really fit the character well. I mean, Ja'an doesn't really feel like Dog the Bounty Hunter. So, Ostrander had Manhunter be a special role within Martian society, a kind of police officer slash soldier slash judge. This way, it fits really well with what Ja'an actually does on Earth. So fighting crime becomes a natural thing for Ja'an to do, as opposed to being part of his made-up personality he keeps around for his friends, like in the DeMatteis version. These Manhunters also have a creed. Once begun, to walk the path, to pursue the prey, to never turn aside short of death until justice is done. They also have a uniform, which is what we think of as Ja'an's costume. Another element where there were contradictions was the fire weakness. DeMatteis made the weakness psychological based on John's trauma watching his wife's body burn, so the weakness had been referenced many times as psychological. But the HyperClan story had reintroduced Martians, and the fire weakness was pretty important for this story. John Ostrander basically says the weakness is a weakness for all Martians, but that it is both physical and psychological. Martians become mentally hypnotized by fire until it consumes their minds. He ties this weakness to fire to the idea of the plague originally presented by DeMatteis. So, this is another kind of contradiction. How did Martian civilization end? Was it a civil war like the one presented by Dennis O'Neil and implied by Grant Morrison, or was it a plague? DeMatteis had been pretty definitive about it being a plague, potentially long in the past, but Morrison has reintroduced the Pale Martians and the idea that there was a war between Green and Pale Martians. But he was fairly vague about the events surrounding this, so Ostrander embraces the plague and places the Civil War in the distant past. But Ostrander was interested in what a telepathic society would be like, and he comes up with the idea of a telepathic plague. This plague is like mental fire that spreads by telepathic contact, and then causes the Martian to spontaneously combust. The nature of this plague explains pretty well how an entire telepathic species could be wiped out very quickly. The war is explained as something that happened long ago and was basically won by the Greens. They exiled the Whites, inadvertently saving them from the plague. The Civil War was not connected to the end of the Martian people like it was in Dennis O'Neil's Bronze Age stories. Another change was that John did not come to Earth carrying the corpse of his daughter. But Ostrander does seem to use this idea a little, with John using his shapeshifting to create a facsimile of his daughter that he can talk to in his madness. So when John is teleported to Earth, he does kind of come through with his dead daughter. But instead of suffering madness on Earth, Earth seems to snap John out of his madness. And since Erdell is no longer needed to help John construct a new identity, his death from the original origin is restored. Erdell's name is also changed to James Erdell, instead of Mark Erdell, which Semexon used, and Saul Erdell, which DeMatteis used. Also, with Morrison having established that Martians had been on Earth, Erdell's teleportation device is revealed as a Martian device. The last big change in the origin is the idea that the detective John Jones was a real person who died. John Jones, the alien, then took his place. I guess the name was a coincidence. This tied into the whole new idea for the character, where John took over the identities of multiple people who had died. I will talk more about this in the next video. Okay, I've talked a lot about the differences, but let me give a quick overview of the origin. I'm going to just go over the rough details, and we'll have another video about the history of Mars and John's place in it. So John is a Martian Manhunter. He is also a family man and has a wife and daughter. A telepathic plague sweeps through the Martian population, killing almost every Martian, including his family. John survives by cutting himself off telepathically. With his species dead, he wanders Mars alone for potentially a very long time and essentially goes crazy. He forms copies of his family with his own flesh and pretends to have conversations with them. But eventually, a Dr. James Erdell experiments with a Martian teleportation device and accidentally teleports John to Earth. This causes a fire which threatens the life of Erdell. John is brought out of his madness by the pleas of Erdell, who he tries to save. But Erdell doesn't make it. Investigating the death is a detective, John Jones. John decides to stalk John Jones invisibly for an entire year. Then Jones is killed by dirty cops, despite John's attempt to save him. John decides to take John Jones's place in order to finish a case he was working on, and then continues being him in order to fight crime. So you have an origin that feels very close to the original Semexon origin and the revised DeMatteis origin, but has a bunch of little changes. In the next video, I will talk about John's human identities, the extended cast in his solo book, and the few romantic relationships in his solo book. If you wanted to encourage me to keep making these, please like, subscribe, and comment.